All right, let's pick up where we left off last time. Also, just FYI, I'm gonna end class even a little bit earlier than usual. I got a meeting at 3 I got to get to. So, all right. So when we left off last time, we were talking about misinformation and disinformation and malinformation. But malinformation is not really within the scope of what we're talking. Malinformation is stuff that's true that can be used against an individual. We kind of already covered that. And it's not, I mean, not that it's not a problem, but it's a different breed than misinformation and disinformation. Because the biggest problems we have with our information sharing systems in terms of truthfulness are in misinformation and disinformation. And then in general, just a data decay and lack of information quality, that information pollution we were talking about last time, are our biggest issues. So misinformation, things that are false but are shared in the belief that it's true, which sometimes begins with disinformation. Disinformation as a term implies that there is a certain maliciousness and intent to deceive behind it. And sometimes on the internet, things can be multiple things all at once, or can evolve, as we talked about with this photo from Kendall Jenner, which was originally a gotcha, which turned into a calculated attack upon her character, I guess, if such a thing could even be achieved. And this is where we got to last time. So with misinformation and disinformation, there's various different stripes. There's lots of information out there on the internet. Some of it, well, there's various different reasons for things to exist. Sometimes it's not necessarily malicious, but there is an intent to deceive. So disinformation that might be created in an intent to be deceptive, but relatively harmless, might be something like a hoax. I mean, these obviously are older than the internet. Here we have an example of a hoax. Archaeological hoaxes have always been really popular. Just a good way to quickly get some cash and recognition, really, more than anything else. It's the pre-internet version of clout chasing. But we still have hoaxes these days. There's a bit of a scandal going on right now with a popular sponsor on YouTube known as Established Titles. Established Titles, I'm sure you're familiar with it because, God, how could you have avoided any of their ads? But if you're not familiar with it, basically it's this service that you pay a nominal fee, and in exchange, you are granted quote unquote ownership over a square foot patch of land in Scotland. And then, as their advertisements say, according to ancient Scottish tradition, all landowners are entitled to use the honorific title of laird, lord, or lady, or whatnot. And the scandal going on right now is that none of that really is true. That in exchange for your money, which in addition to granting you that title is meant to be donated to preserve the natural beauty of Scotland and plant trees and whatnot, may or may not actually go to planting trees, but definitely goes to a third-party organization that's responsible for fulfilling that promise. And it's the UK, so the guy's got some weird title, but it's like the Pontifex of Titles and Colors, or whatever the hell it is over there in Scotland, has made it clear that simply owning a square foot patch of dirt does not grant one a lordship or ladyship. And also, by the way, when you are granted insignificant amounts of land, then you don't actually own it and can't actually do anything with it anyway. Anyway, the reason I'm bringing this up is because, obviously it's a scandal right now, but that is it's not a new kind of thing. The concept, the very idea of selling titles or honorifics or intangible assets in that fashion isn't something that Established Titles began. It's been going around for literally hundreds and thousands of years, probably. But, along the same lines of other novelty gifts, like buying a star and naming it after somebody, or an asteroid, or something along those lines. Those have always been around. The purpose of them, of course, well, I mean, there are some who took it very seriously. They're pretty upset. But the purpose of all of those kinds of services hasn't been a hoax per se. It's always been a novelty gift kind of a thing. But it plays upon that idea, the idea of a hoax, that it's meant to be harmless, but yet some people can believe it and can be harmed. See, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago, Poe's law, no matter how obvious satire or the intentional, non-serious nature of material on the internet, there's always going to be somebody who's going to believe it. So every hoax, no matter how outrageous or intentionally silly, will at some point be accepted as fact and reality for someone, which causes a problem when it leads to conspiracy theories. Not all conspiracy theories, of course, are generated out of hoaxes, but the issue is that a hoax can quickly become a conspiracy theory, as we've seen multiple times on one of the many hotbeds, the genesis of many a hoax turned unfortunate reality, places like 4chan, where it starts out as a joke and then somebody believes it, and next thing you know, you've got actual white supremacists doing the OK sign and using Pepe the Frog on their flags and shields, and Q conspiracy leads to Capitol insurrection and so on and so forth, right? We'll talk about some specific theories, I guess, in a second. But a conspiracy theory is essentially, and this I believe is how, I think I have the FBI's definition here. No, I suppose not. Well, a conspiracy theory is basically any event or situation that invokes a conspiracy by sinister and powerful groups, often political in motivation, where other explanations are more probable. And that definition alone is already problematic for us because we live in an era where information is intentionally being kept from us, and often it will be exposed. We talked about Snowden earlier this week. And prior to 2013, the notion that the government was spying on everyone just simply due to virtue of the passage of the USA Patriot Act was considered something of a conspiracy theory, but eventually it bore out to be true. So that's a problematic definition in and of itself. The problem with conspiracy theories isn't necessarily that they exist. It's usually that it is also in and of itself a form of disinformation. The best way to hide the truth is in plain sight, so to speak. And so conspiracy theories have been created, and there are multiple examples we'll go over in just a moment, as a way to cover for the unfortunate truth. That's why conspiracy theories are so difficult for us to defeat, is because it's something that is difficult to prove or disprove, or in the case of the most pervasive and long-lasting conspiracy theories, those that actually resist falsification because they're either reinforced by circular reasoning, i.e. a Q made a prediction, all of Q's predictions become true. He's 100% correct all the time. Q's prediction didn't come true. Ipso facto, the deep state was involved, or the plan was foiled, or something along those lines. Some excuse that resists the falsification of Q as the prophet and arbiter of truth. Not that that's what they believe, but you know what I mean. Conspiracy theories also persist in the absence of evidence. Verisimilitude is pre-granted in the case of conspiracy theories. But this is another reason why conspiracy theories are so pervasive and difficult for us to combat in our day and age, is because the decentralization of publishing authority means everyone can put their opinion out there, and what is or is not an authoritative source is essentially granted by each of the readers. So, for example, the Q I keep referring to, by the way, if you're not familiar with the conspiracy, is the QAnon conspiracy. I'm sure you've heard of the QAnon shaman. What was his name? Chansey something or other, the guy at the Capitol riots. So QAnon is a current conspiracy theory. One day on 4chan a couple years ago, there was a post by somebody who merely claimed to be a government insider, somebody working for the intelligence agencies. They posted a bunch of crazy shit to, it wasn't even poll. What did they put? Was it B? I don't know. They posted to some subboard. I don't remember which one it was. But in any event, it was just a list of things. And I'm a government insider. All of this is happening. All of this is going to happen. Trump is The next God Emperor, he's fighting the deep state, and so on and so forth. And it was not just the one post, it was a couple of posts that really kind of got the ball rolling on this one. But what authority was granted, what proof was offered? Well, that's the beauty of the conspiracy theory, is they can't offer proof because that would invalidate their theory, but it would also invalidate their verisimilitude, because of course, nobody who's a deep government insider posting to 4chan is going to reveal themselves, right? That would falsify themselves by offering verification. So, where did that authority come from? Well, it was granted to them by the readers. Right? They supported the message, they spread it, and look at it now, right? It's certainly gone places as far as conspiracy theories go. So they can't be proven or disproven, or they aren't easily proven or disproven. But another reason that they're so difficult for us to combat is because, generally speaking, with conspiracy theories, there's just enough plausibility, if not probability, within them that it makes refuting them either an uphill battle, or simply because of the bullshit asymmetry principle, the amount of effort it takes to refute them is far greater than that to change them or spread them, and so they tend to go a long way and tend to last a long time. So, for example, the Kennedy assassination was the center of many conspiracy theories, and still is. Let's be honest, it still is. One, of course, the events as we know, as they transpired, 1963, President Kennedy riding in an open-top convertible in Dallas, Texas, was shot several times from a high-up angle by Lee Harvey Oswald, to the best of our knowledge, using a Carcano rifle. And immediately following his death, the conspiracy theory surrounding the assassination began, leading to congressional investigations, even up to, you don't hear so much about Kennedy anymore because there's just other things to latch onto now, but even as late as the 90s, the Oliver Stone JFK movie, I think that was the 90s, some of these theories were still being repeated, the grassy knoll and the CIA connection. Why would anyone believe that America's intelligence agencies, sworn to uphold our virtues, protect American citizens, and project our interests at home and abroad, why would anybody truly believe that they would be involved in a situation like that? Well, number one, to be clear, the conspiracy theory that the CIA or any other three-letter organization was involved in the Kennedy assassination is disinformation. What happened with that is the Russian intelligence agency, and this is, of course, the Cold War era prior to the internet, they planted a story in an Italian newspaper that implied a link between the Kennedy assassination and the CIA, and the fact that there was other suspects who were actually arrested and arraigned at the time. One of them, Cody Shaw, is the subject of this conspiracy theory. Now, Shaw was acquitted. He didn't even have any links to the CIA. But the Russians planted the story, which caused to be picked up in the international press. And, well, there you go. That conspiracy theory lasted, I think it was even part of the plot of the JFK movie for Oliver Stone. So it lasted a good 30 years or possibly slightly longer. Oh, right. Yeah. So why would anybody believe something like that? Well, because we do know that the CIA was involved in assassinations all the time, just not US presidents, right? The American foreign interests, our foreign policy, during the Kennedy administration, the Bay of Pigs fiasco, later on, look at the destabilization in Latin America, in the Middle East. All of this is the result of our own foreign policy projections, the assassination and toppling of regimes that we found to be unfriendly to our interests. It was a big part of what we did. So is it really so hard to believe that the CIA may be involved in the assassination of Kennedy? Well, it's that plausibility, it's that seed of doubt, and that seed of doubt allows the conspiracy theory to grow. Pizzagate, we talked about before. Pizzagate is a conspiracy theory. And as a matter of fact, there was also a really popular image that went around regarding Pizzagate. Let me see if I can quick find it. Probably got to turn the safe search off for this one, I'm guessing. Constantly. Oh, dang. Oh, well, if I had a little foresight, I'd have grabbed it ahead of time, but I didn't. There was even a popular Photoshop going around, which supposedly showed Hillary in the basement of this pizza parlor. So again, if you're not familiar, Pizzagate, the idea that at the highest echelons of power in the United States government, but particularly within the Democratic Party, there is an international child sex trafficking ring that is run out of many places, but one of those in part a comic pizzeria that in the basement, of course, which the pizza parlor actually has no basement, and this is obviously completely out there. But why would anybody? Also, the whole QAnon thing is part of an evolution of Pizzagate as well. The idea that there's child sex trafficking and even child sacrifice and ritualistic consumption of human flesh and so on. That's all part of the whole QAnon thing too. But why would anybody believe that at the highest echelons of power, there's going to be people in the Democratic Party or the Republican Party or anywhere else that might be involved in international child sex trafficking? Well, I mean, Jeffrey Epstein, right? It's crazy until eventually we find evidence that there's something going on. Not that the Pizzagate conspiracy is true, it's not, but yeah, there's really powerful people in that little black book that he kept. And that's why, you know, the belief that Epstein is not responsible for his own death by his own hand is another such popular theory, right? Because why wouldn't somebody who had that kind of information on people that powerful, why wouldn't somebody take steps to silence them? It's just enough plausibility to open the door for doubt, and that doubt allows the theory to grow. And our government has done truly reprehensible things which we know about, which were either an open secret or later leaked or later declassified. Things like literal mind control experiments with MK Ultra, or the COINTELPRO program, ingratiating themselves within certain civil rights movements and attempting to take them down from within, and so on and so forth. You know, conspiracy theories in general, there's a reason that they exist. I think that it's the general the general path for people is one of least resistance, but this kind of defies that convention, right? Because to believe a conspiracy theory is to work really hard at believing them, because you're avoiding more plausible explanations as a result. So I guess it's something of a contradiction. But I think that part of the reason why they're so pervasive is because, well, people work so hard to spread them, right? And well, and by hard work, I don't mean that it's something that's going on constantly. I guess what I mean is that they are crafted so carefully that they make the world maybe a little bit more exciting, but more importantly, while people generally choose the path of least resistance, during our social engineering unit, we did talk about things that motivate human behavior, things that get people involved, not just compliance, but actually continue to have them, for example, spread these theories and share them, and even cut people out of their life who don't believe them, and so on. And what is one of the most powerful motivating factors we talked about? Well, it was inspirational appeal. And with so many of these, that is precisely what you get, right? The truth is out there. And if you know the truth, you have a duty to fight the demon-worshiping, child-consuming politicians hiding in the basement of a pizza parlor. A certain amount of righteousness. And it's a self-reinforcing policy as well, because we develop echo chambers and we tend to live in them. And that's where these kinds of theories can really grow legs and last quite a long time. Because while they can be fought in places where they're presented, that fight can only happen if both ideas are presented on fairly equal footing. I mean, they shouldn't be equal because not all ideas are equal. But what I'm getting at is in echo chambers, one side will be silenced. Essentially, anything that disagrees with the narrative will be silenced. This is true no matter regardless of what idea we're talking about, but just particularly with conspiracy theories. So echo chambers lead to polarization and hyperpartisanship, but probably not in the way, and definitely, I don't know if anybody here has those ideas, but not in the way which, in my experience, most people think. So most people think, or I should say the conventional wisdom seems to be that spending all of your time in echo chambers means that you're exposed to certain ideas, and the logical conclusion is that if you're exposed to ideas, you will adopt ideas, and if you adopt ideas, you will spread ideas, and so on. But as it turns out, that's not really the case, right? If you're not predisposed to accepting a certain rationale, let's say that you've read about Pizzagate, you understand the story, it doesn't necessarily mean that you're ready to believe it. And I mean, the truth is, I mean, if you're anything like me, you probably spend a lot of time listening to ideas and consuming media from people that have absolutely abhorrent positions. And yet you're no closer to their positions than you were when you started. If you do consume that kind of media and you do find yourself starting to agree with those people, then please stop. But if you're not, then, I mean, that alone proves that just being exposed to ideas isn't necessarily enough. But we do develop echo chambers. It just doesn't necessarily work the way most people think that they do, because there have been plenty of studies at this point done on misinformation and disinformation. And while people can be manipulated, simply being exposed to ideas, even at the exclusion of alternate points of view, does not necessarily automatically mean that you accept those viewpoints. So something is going on. There is a disconnect. Echo chambers exist, but they're not necessarily radicalizing people. What they might be doing, if anything else, is, as we talked about before, is moving that Overton window, allowing maybe for additional consumption of other more radical ideas, which again doesn't necessarily lead to acceptance, but does, in terms of the economics of the internet, mean that it does spread that message farther. So essentially what we're saying here is that if we were to take a population of just 10 individuals, if 6 of those individuals can be exposed to a message and it means nothing, but if the entire group listens to whatever message the majority votes for, those 6 people vote for the message that's abhorrent because they consider it to be entertainment or interesting or what have you, then that means all 10 of them now are exposed to it. And if the other 4 are completely clueless or easily led astray, a type of personality that's willing to accept the whatever message is fed to them, or if it leads them to believe that because the group, the majority, decided to consume that content, that it's a promotion of that content or acceptance of it, well, then they're more likely to accept it. So basically, what I'm saying is it's the old George Carlin bit. If you consider how stupid the average person is, consider that half of the entire population is even dumber than they are, and you realize the scope of the problem that we're dealing with. So there are people out there who are easily influenced, and because of the economics of the internet, the way that we currently have things set up, even if you don't accept those kinds of messages, just participating in them, and that's clicks. That leads to engagement, that leads to promotion, and so it gets out to more people. So we also have talked before about fake news. It's not a new thing at all. But to be clear on what we're talking about here, we're not talking about the mainstream media or anything like that. I mean, I certainly have my own share of beefs with the mainstream media, but that's neither here nor there for this topic. But there are media sources out there that are just simply making up information. And I don't think can be disputed. It's not a new phenomenon, right? We've talked about fake news before. being the result of the economics of our news dissemination systems and markets since prior to the internet. Typically, what generates fake news is, well, I mean, it's market forces, right? So pecuniary, so advertising revenue, and occasionally ideological too. As a matter of fact, prior to the creation of the internet, there used to be a cult. I think they're probably still around in the United States, but probably not so much anymore. But they were known as the Moonies. They were led by a gentleman named Sung Moon. And there was a time when they were extremely influential in the United States. Like the Hare Krishnas at the airport, they would panhandle for money, but behind the scenes, Sung Moon was a millionaire and had a lot of business ties. And there was a time in the United States that if you went and had sushi anywhere in the United States, there was a 90% chance that at least some of your money was going to the Moonies. Well, there was a couple of papers that were around, the Washington Post and the Washington Times. And Sung Moon was not a big fan of the Post because they were running ads, or not ads, they were running stories about some of the stuff he was getting into, because he was interested in politics, he was donating to Nixon's campaign and so on. And the Post was reporting things like, you know, this is a cult, they're in bed with politicians and business, people should know about this. And so what did Sung Moon do? He went out and purchased the Washington Times, the competitor of the Washington Post. And much like when Bezos purchased the Washington Post many decades later, suddenly the Times had a much more favorable view of the Moonies and Sung Moon himself and the Nixon administration for that matter. So it was intentional fake news. It is propaganda. So it's been around. It's not a new thing. As a matter of fact, there's some publications that completely make their bones off of just printing fake news, right? The Weekly World News is the newspaper of record for the United States. They've been sued, I don't even know at this point how many times, dozens and dozens of times, for the stories that they post. Of course, the other rag magazines that we have, the Daily Mail over in the UK, or the Sun, or whatever. There's plenty of them out there. But so again, why are we so willing to believe in the concept of fake news? The same reason that we're so willing to believe in some conspiracy theories, because it just makes sense. It's a plausibility or probability, right? If you were to say, well, fake news isn't a thing, I could just say, oh, so you believe Bat Boy exists? I mean, of course, Bat Boy exists. I'm sorry. Do you believe Hillary Clinton actually adopted an alien baby? You know, there's plenty of examples to point to. And it's a false equivalency, of course, right? That's a completely facile argument, because just because the Weekly World News prints fake news doesn't mean every news source prints fake news. But there's plenty of other stories, just like the government occasionally doing things that are absolutely unconstitutional and illegal and oversteps their bounds. We're willing to believe that they would do it again. Just like, you know, news media has made mistakes in the past, we're willing to accept that they would do it again, or that they would be willing to sell out their scruples in exchange for stories or ad revenue or whatever, because again, it's also happened, right? So there was a study I'm going to take just a brief look at here. This is from 2021 regarding data that was collected in 2020. This was leading up to the election, and this was the 2016 election that they were studying. So they studied Facebook as the primary information consumption mechanism, because Facebook at that point, by the 2016 election, I mean, it still is technically, I guess, the most popular social media network. But back then it was definitely the most popular social media network. So what they noticed is that as far as election stories went, the number of stories and the consumption of stories on the site skyrocketed leading up to the election itself. Part of this they found was due to the promotion of the site. So the actual original posters promoting their own content that they've posted. But a good portion of it began to organically evolve from the way the social media site works by sharing and liking the posts, so driving up that engagement. Meanwhile, stories from what would be considered to be mainstream news sources, not legitimate news sources, mainstream news sources. Because again, I'm not a media literacy expert or historian, but I'm not sure anybody would classify fake news and legitimate news, because that's definitely a bridge too far. But at any rate, so mainstream news sources became a lot less favorable leading up to the election, and was eventually overtaken prior to election day. Now, some of the fake stories here, this is the top stories that they had here. So Pope Francis shocks world, endorses Donald Trump from ending the Fed. WikiLeaks confirms Hillary sold weapons to ISIS, the political insider. Another one from ending the Fed, two more from ending the Fed, sorry. It's over. Hillary's ISIS email just leaked, and it's worse than anyone could have imagined. Just read the law. Hillary is disqualified from holding any federal office. And the Denver Guardian, FBI agent suspected in Hillary email leaks found dead and apparent murder-suicide. So these sources, what they classified in this study as fake news, obviously ending the Fed. And if you're not familiar with these publications, let's see if, I'm not even sure if ending the Fed is still around. Oh, it is. Ending the Fed, whose tagline is literally exposing the fraud of the Federal Reserve. Single issue voters. So obviously they would definitely have the scoop when it comes to Pope Francis. They are Vatican insiders if I ever heard any. And of course the other stories they have here. Just read the law. Yeah, so when they say fake news, they're not talking about story or organizations that don't traditionally have press passes or anything like that. They're organizations here that are literally publishing at best opinion columns as facts, which again would qualify a lot of mainstream media sources, if you ask me. But at any rate, these are the kinds of stories. But we can see why they might be so popular in terms of their overtaking mainstream media sources. If we look at those stories, right? So the Washington Post, the Huffington Post, New York Post, CNN, New York Times. Trump's history of corruption is mind-boggling. So why is Clinton supposedly the corrupt one? Stop pretending you know why people hate Hillary Clinton. Melania Trump's girl on girl photos from race. So we can see why. So is this a failure of our information dissemination systems? Is it a failure of people on Facebook to do the legwork to sort out and promote only official sources? I remember going through this period. I'm sure you probably do too. And I remember thinking then precisely what I'm thinking now, looking at these over again. And it's no, this is a failure of our news sources. Because what are they reporting on? They're reporting on the fake news stories. The fake news stories are pushing their agenda. Or, and I remember this was real big, even at a time where there was no end to legitimate news to talk about, they focused on the dumbest shit, just the dumbest non-issues, nothing burgers, all over the place. Ford fact checks Trump, we will be here forever. I ran the CIA, now I'm endorsing Hillary Clinton. So news stories that aren't particularly influential. They might be more factual, but factual does not mean influential. And it's not necessarily up to the news media itself. I mean, part of how people know what they know is because news is shared. But they have a market interest to protect, and long has been their history in protecting that interest. So of course they're going to go for the salacious titles, right? Of course they are. But it kind of fails the entire system and puts them in this position where other things look like actual news but aren't, when the actual news isn't, right? So how big of a problem was this? This is a December 2016 survey, Pew Research Center survey. Wanted to quantify or at least get people's opinions on how big a deal misinformation or fake news was for them in their decision. So most considered that it was a lot of confusion. Almost nobody was willing to put forth and say that they were very good at recognizing fake news. The reason for that is because even if you go direct to news sources, like I just Googled end of Fed, that was fairly apparent. But if we go to a mainstream media news source like CNN here, even today, after we get the ad taking up a third of the goddamn page, we've got ads mixed in that appear to be actual news stories. We've got opinion pieces, but this, I mean, they're labeled, but you know, they're in there, they're above the fold here, right? And this is just one site. And most people don't go directly to their sources, right? Most people get their news from news aggregation services, even those on social media like Facebook, right? So if it's presented on Facebook, it becomes even more difficult to determine whether or not something is legitimate. You have to do some legwork on that, which is, well, I guess we'll get to that in a moment, which is our only real solution at this point. So what all this means is that when our information and news dissemination systems kind of become commingled in this fashion, or when there are incentives, economic incentives in this case, for news media to report on other stories which are less consequential to informing the population, but which are more profitable, we run into a series of concerns, just as we have concerns with the consumption of information behind the scenes without any transparency. So things like, for example, the conversion of popularity into legitimacy, or, I mean, argumentum ad populum, but we're not talking about individual rhetoric here. What we're talking about is just the idea that because, for example, an influencer has a huge following, that they must be an authority on the subject, or just because a lot of people believe in something, it must be true, right? Like if thousands of people or hundreds of people, I don't remember exactly what the count was, if hundreds of people believe in the Q conspiracy enough to storm the Capitol, well, that many people can't possibly be wrong, right? We also have some other concerns as well, because right now we have economic interests, like on Facebook and Twitter and everywhere else, that control information dissemination systems. We have economic factors on our news creation, content creators that are informing their decisions. But what happens if, for example, we have an undemocratic leader that seizes one of these systems, right? And then instead of having an economic interest that governs everything, which at least is is some factor that can be influenced by people, even undemocratically, but at least through their usage of the site. Undemocratic leaders aren't governed by anything but, you know, their own constraints, if they even have it, or bots. It's ironic. Elon Musk wanted to hold up the Twitter purchase because he was convinced that there were more bots than Twitter originally let on. But yeah, of course there are. It's Twitter. It's probably more than half bots, you know. But then goes ahead and releases a poll on whether or not to unban certain unnamed individuals based upon simple popularity, right? So are there bots that are doing, are there tons of bots that are making the site undemocratic? Or can we have polls that pure votes to determine whether or not something happens? Right? It's talking out of both sides of their mouth. And of course, the spread of intolerance and hate speech, which obviously a huge problem on many social media sites, particularly Twitter now, which become impossible really to combat given the current tools that we have available to us, which are the primary way that we combat disinformation and misinformation online. We have very few actual tools available to us. Right now, we're relying almost entirely on self-regulation. So Facebook, they have people that, well, individual users are empowered to report content. There are automated systems that will flag content and even suspend or ban users based upon suspected content. But there's a great deal of safety and security individuals at Facebook that manually review content and reports in order to act on them. Twitter used to have a bunch as well, but famously now there's one individual working on all content for Southeast Asia. Can't imagine what their life is like. Honestly, I've had a chance to talk to some people who do those kinds of jobs. And my own experience in forensics, I know a lot of individuals who have dealt with some pretty horrible things, having to see. As a matter of fact, for forensic experts, if you end up working at a place like the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children or the Internet Crimes Against Children Division, on average, the burnout rate is so high that you usually make it about 2 years before you just can't take it anymore. It's a similar sort of burnout rate for people who are working on social media and safety and security teams, because God, the internet is a cesspool. In 1999, one of the reasons that the Matrix became so popular is because technology brought with it this promise of a potential utopia and the unification of the human race, and how in the future all things would be connected and all of that. It's very idealistic, because even in '99, there were people that looked on the internet and saw that, well, this is going to change everything, but it's not going to change us. And that's precisely what happened. Instead, the internet made everybody stupid. Hope's not lost, though, because there are other things that we can do if we're prepared to move in that direction. Self-regulation is what we've got now. It's not going to be enough. We can, instead of having social media sites or any site really using technology for the purposes of their own financial gain, which again, as corporations, is their primary impetus and ought always to be, doesn't mean that they can't be regulated and that algorithms can't be made to be transparent, so that at least we understand how they work. There's already people who spend a great deal of time trying to game systems and understand the algorithms so that they can promote their content above all others. Simply publishing them effectively does nothing. The reason that places like YouTube and Twitter and Facebook don't publish their algorithms is because if they do, then they're beholden to their user base whenever it requires or whenever they would like to make a change. And they, of course, don't want to do that because they don't want to deal with that kind of stuff, right? It's their proprietary algorithms. They also don't want to share them with any other competitors, but there's nothing that says that they can't be regulated to do so. And right now we have what are known as grievance redressal mechanisms for people that have been harmed, but they suck. I mean, reporting is about the best you're going to get. Disliking is about the best you're going to get. But for people who are actually harmed in these cases, courts have often sided, because of Section 230, with the platforms themselves, meaning that they are essentially indemnified from any harm that may result as a usage of their service. But it does not always have to be that way. And then last, just greater transparency in general, not just with their algorithms, but with how things are working on the back end. One of the benefits, I suppose, of Elon's takeover of Twitter is, if his own tweets are to be believed, we understand more how Twitter is actually put together and actually functions than we ever have before. Although, again, you'd have to believe his tweets in order to find out. Oh, great, CNN just popped up a full page ad. Awesome. We also talked about that before. In terms of transparency, right? What's the adage I'm thinking of? Lies are free, the truth you have to pay for. That's what I'm thinking of. You go to New York Times or Washington Post or any quote unquote real news sources, you are often greeted with a paywall. So a subscription to the New York Times, which of course, as a print, when it was in print media, required a subscription. Now it's all online. You get a couple of stories. Let's see if I can, not sure how many you get a day. Yeah, there it is. I don't visit the New York Times. I'm not even currently logged in any account in this browser. Can't read the news. You have to pay for it. Lies are free, the truth you have to pay for. So papers of records. Oh, and ironically, oh, this really burns me. I mean, I get why they're doing it, right? Because, obviously they have to make their money too. I would argue there are better ways to do that. You can monetize content a million different ways online, and you don't have to do this. But the Washington Post does the same thing, essentially. But look at their tagline. Is democracy dies in darkness. Absolute irony of ironies. I wonder if anyone at the Washington Post sees that every day and dies a little inside. Where is it? Well, it pops up eventually. I don't know how many stories you get. All right, so however, when it comes to fighting misinformation and disinformation, the majority of the onus for being able to even identify it to begin with is entirely on us. We can't trust the platforms that we use to do it for us because, well, not to get conspiracy theory-ish myself, but I mean, at best, they're not responsible for it. And at worst, they're provided an incentive not to. Because just because something is misinformation, it really doesn't matter to them. If it's driving people to their site and users are sharing it, there's engagement, then they're winning. They're coming out ahead. Right? Their advertisers are getting more clicks, they're getting more usage, and that's all good for them. They have virtually no incentive to be the boring site that only tells the truth. So it's kind of on us, but we don't have a lot of great tools to do that either, right? What we're told is to engage in vertical reading and lateral reading. That's how we're supposed to verify sources and whatnot. So vertical reading is when you stay on the page, when you examine content closely. If you check their About Me section, you check into their organization, you look at errors on the page and so on. Whereas lateral reading is looking out at other sources. So like, for example, checking into their own reputation, seeing if a story has been reported by multiple reliable sources, using the web to trace information, quotes, or whatever to see if any of that junk is out. But it doesn't really help us at all. I mean, sure, that helps us with some of the less convincing, I guess, misinformation and disinformation that may be out there, but anyone who puts even a little bit of work into it, they do just fine. And also, it doesn't even come close to addressing the main problem with misinformation or disinformation, which is that it can easily be planted and then repeated by reputable sources, exactly as the Russian intelligence agency did with that Italian newspaper in 1963, right? They were able to do it through print media back then. It's going to be even harder now when there are millions of different sources and we can no longer determine which records are even reputable. So we get infographics like this, right? Telling us, make sure it's not a joke, consider the source and all that. But the deck is really stacked against us. And we're running low on time, so I'm not going to play this video, but check it out yourself if you like. Another problem that we have is, of course, misinformation and disinformation campaigns can't necessarily be traced back directly to the individuals that begin those stories. So, for example, one of the things that you're meant to ask, not on this infographic, but one of the things that you're meant to ask whenever you're suspicious of anything is cui bono. Who would benefit from this story that denigrates Hillary Clinton or something like that? Well, the answer is going to be, well, there's going to be a series of individuals in that case, I guess, but obviously certain foreign interests are going to be among them. So even if you begin to do your digging, you would think, okay, eventually I'm going to come back to a source that relates somewhere within Russia. But no, that's not the case. It's the 21st century. We have the internet, and instead, misinformation campaigns aren't even necessarily run out of the countries that we're originally talking about. So even if we manage to trace everything back, as with some fake news stories for the 2016 election, we would instead be traced back to maybe sources within Macedonia, because there's a small village in Macedonia that, for the lead up to the 2016 election, the entire village had basically been contracted to, spread misinformation. So in our echo chambers, there are two main methods for spreading misinformation and disinformation, known as seeding and echoing. And places like that operation in Macedonia but also among organized crime and state actors all over the world. For example, in Russia, they have a very sophisticated cyber warfare operation. But when I say that, while all of them are connected to the Russian government, none of them are directly connected to the Russian government. And there's not just one body that does it. So we're talking about, let's say, a dozen or more different groups of individuals that are tasked with different objectives, who aren't even necessarily aware of each other's existence. And some of them are working on actual hacking, computer crime, and some of them are working on disinformation campaigns, and some of them are just working on misinformation campaigns. So it's not like a monolithic type of enterprise. But what they'll do is basically, and it's not obviously just Russia, everybody does this. Just like with the Snowden leak, it wasn't just America that's doing all of this stuff. It's just worse because it's America. Everyone's got these programs. Anyway, so what they're doing is one of two main things: seeding and or echoing. Seeding is when one group will essentially plant stories in different places. They'll use social media to either so what they'll do is, it's not, some of them are bot accounts, of course, but what we're really talking about here with seeding is not bots. We're talking about individuals that make connections online. Sometimes they'll make connections with like official sources, news reporters or members of government agencies, or oath keepers or other militia members or something like that. They'll make connections, and those connections may or may not even be aware that they're contacting a foreign agent with a disinformation service. They might know them. The oath keeper Jed might think that he's got a friend down in Florida who works as a postal officer but also can run guns. If he ever needs anything like that, and they have an online sort of friendship going on. This friend down in Florida contacts Jed and say, "Oh my God, did you see this? What's going on with the Biden administration?" And sends him a link to an article which has been previously seeded but yet hasn't been shared. And of course, then that individual is going to share it with all of his friends in the Oath Keepers and other militia organizations, and so on and so forth. That's a seeding process. But seeding alone isn't always enough because, again, we tend to fall into the trap where what is popular is true. And so if we're spreading a story and people find it hard to believe, it's not really getting any traction. Sometimes it requires a bit of a boost, and that's what echoing is. Echoing either is that same organization or another organization that's purely dedicated to the task. An echoing organization might not even be aware that the message they're echoing is false. This is part of a propaganda wing, right? So the actual organization in Russia is the Internet Research Group. The Internet Research Group is a group of individuals whose entire job is not to create misinformation or disinformation, but their job is basically to go out and spend all of their time on the internet. They have a list of talking points that they're given from the Kremlin, from the government, and basically if it agrees with those talking points, they are to support it and spread it, share it, upvote it, and if it doesn't, to downvote it, to dislike it, to suppress that information, right? That's their whole job. So they don't even necessarily know that the story is false, but they're told all of a sudden that any stories related to Joe Biden wandering around the White House doing coke, that is something that they want them to, well, then they do, right? They're not even aware that it's a story that was seeded by a completely different organization within their own government. They just have their marching orders, and so they'll do. And there's a lot of different ways that seeding and echoing can occur. Echoing is fairly simple. It's more or less the process I just described. But seeding doesn't necessarily mean planting a story in an Italian newspaper anymore. Now, seeding might instead be, for example, using those contacts and trying to spread the word out that the deep state, for example, has gotten control over the LA Times. And so nothing the LA Times says after a certain date is to be trusted. Kind of like how when Elon had that scandal where he was accused of sexual misconduct, And the day before that story broke, he sent out a tweet that said something like, I'm going to vote the Republican Party, watch the media attack me from now on. It's selective censorship, right? He's getting ahead of the story. He's basically saying anything anyone says about me tomorrow about sexual misconduct is a complete lie because I'm Republican now. Manipulation of search rankings, that can be a form of echoing as well, but seeding search rankings can be done because most search engines, believe it or not, are for-profit organizations. Shocking, I know. And you can pay to promote your site up in search rankings, and that's definitely a form of seeding. Hacking, of course, there's cybercrime organizations that work either officially or unofficially with government agencies all the time, and they will intentionally target methods of information dissemination in order to suppress certain stories. I just see here now that it's 3 o'clock. I got to run to that meeting, so that'll be it for now. We'll finish this up next week. Have a good weekend.